This is the story of a mistake, a single misunderstood word that sent 5,000 soldiers on a suicidal march straight into the heart of a 60,000-man army. They should have been annihilated in minutes, blown apart by cannon, and trampled into the mud by 10,000 charging horsemen. They should have been a footnote, a cautionary tale of military disaster. But what happened instead, on the misty fields of Minden, became one of the most bizarre and legendary victories in military history. To understand how such a fatal error could even happen, we have to see the battlefield as the two commanders did on that August morning in 1759. This was the brutal heart of the 7 Years' War, a conflict that had spilled across continents. Here, in the German states, the fighting was personal. At stake was the electorate of Hanover, the ancestral home of King George II of Great Britain. For the French, capturing it would be a humiliation for the British crown. For the alliance of Britain, Prussia, and smaller German states, holding it was a matter of honor and strategic necessity. The key to this entire theater of war was the fortified city of Minden. Before that city stood the Allied army, a patchwork force of red-coated British, blue-coated Hanoverians, and Hessians. Commanding this disparate force was the Allied commander, Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, a man whose name was spoken with respect across Europe. A protégé of Frederick the Great himself, he possessed a cool, analytical mind that saw the battlefield as a complex problem to be solved. He was not a general given to rash gambles, but a master of the calculated risk, known for luring his opponents into overextending themselves. Facing him was the French commander, a confident aristocrat who embodied the martial pride of France. He was utterly convinced that he had outmaneuvered his cautious opponent. He had chosen his ground with the eye of a predator. His army of 60,000 men was arrayed in a position of immense strength. His left flank was anchored on the boggy, impassable terrain of the Great Peat Bog. His right flank was pressed firmly against the wide, swift-flowing Weser River, guarded by the cannons of Minden itself. His center, a formidable concentration of 85 squadrons of elite cavalry and powerful infantry, was deployed on the open heathland ground practically tailor-made for a massed cavalry charge. He had laid a perfect trap. The plan was a model of strategic elegance: use a detached corps to threaten the Allied rear, forcing them to send a small force forward into the open ground. Once that force was isolated and exposed, the French commander would unleash his hammer blow. 10,000 of France's finest horsemen would surge forward and obliterate them, creating a shockwave of panic that would roll up the entire Allied army. It was a flawless plan on paper, but a flawless plan depends on flawless execution. The Allied commander had his own plan for a coordinated attack, which relied on precise timing. His order, intended for his entire army, was for the advance to begin with drums beating once a specific signal cannon was fired. But in the fog of war, the message was entrusted to a young German aide who, struggling with the nuances of command language, delivered a critically altered version to the British infantry. The order that reached them was to advance at the sound of drums. As the drummers of a nearby battery began beating the rhythm for their own repositioning, that flawed order was triggered. The command, when it came down the line, made no sense. It was a death sentence delivered in a calm voice. To advance now, to march forward at a steady pace, without the thunder of supporting artillery, without their own cavalry to screen their flanks. To walk across 1,000 yards of open ground, directly into the mouths of 66 French cannons and the waiting embrace of the most feared cavalry in Europe. It had to be a catastrophic, world-ending misunderstanding. Yet the order was repeated. For the professional soldiers of the British and Hanoverian line, an order was absolute. Veteran colonels exchanged sharp, questioning glances. They could see the French lines, a vast and terrifying sea of white coats and gleaming bayonets. They could see the dark, dense mass of cavalry at the center of that line, a coiled serpent waiting to strike. But the drums were beating. And so, discipline, ingrained through years of relentless drill, overrode every instinct for survival. With a sound of 5,000 pairs of boots hitting the damp earth as one, the line began to move. It was not a frantic charge, but a steady, resolute rhythm that seemed to mock the insanity of the situation. Colors were unfurled. the proud silk standards of the 6 British regiments catching the morning breeze. The line was a perfect, unwavering wall of men, stepping off from the rest of its own army, an island of red moving slowly across a green field. From his command post, the Allied commander watched in absolute, stomach-churning horror. He immediately dispatched his fastest riders to halt them, but it was too late. The brigade was committed, marching calmly toward what every soldier on that field knew was certain death. So what happens when 5,000 men follow an order they know is meant to kill them? If you enjoy stories of incredible courage against impossible odds, this is a perfect moment to subscribe to our channel. We explore the battles and heroes that history almost forgot, and your support allows us to keep telling their tales. From the French lines, the sight was met first with utter bewilderment, which quickly curdled into predatory glee. The French officers laughed. The enemy was simply walking into the killing ground voluntarily. It was a gift. The ground began to tremble as 11 squadrons of elite French cavalry surged forward. This was the pride of the French army, the king's own household cavalry, clad in gleaming steel cuirasses and plumed helmets, a wave of horseflesh and sharpened steel. The initial orderly trot built to a canter, and then to a full, thunderous, earth-shaking charge. The red line was about to be erased from history. But the British officers had a secret weapon they were about to unleash, a radical new way of firing. For the men in the red line, the world compressed into the sight and sound of that approaching storm. The noise was a physical force, a deafening roar of hooves and war cries that hammered at the senses. The sun glinted off a forest of drawn sabers. The instinct to run, to break formation, to fire wildly and flee, was a screaming voice in every man's mind. But the line held. Officers and sergeants walked calmly behind the ranks, their voices steady amidst the rising din. Hold your fire, lads. Hold. Wait for the command. Let them come closer. The cavalry closed the distance 400 yards, 200, 100. At 50 yards, the air was thick with the smell of horse sweat. Still, the line held, muskets steady, a wall of silent, waiting men. Then came the command, a single sharp word that cut through the chaos like a whip crack. Fire. From one end of the 9 regiments to the other, a single, perfectly coordinated volley erupted. 5,000 muskets discharged at once, a deafening crack of thunder that unleashed a storm of lead and thick, acrid smoke. The effect on the charging cavalry was catastrophic. The front rank of the French horsemen simply ceased to exist, tumbling into a screaming, tangled mass of death and agony, their momentum absorbed as if they had crashed into a solid granite cliff. The squadrons behind plowed into the wreckage of those in front, creating utter, horrifying chaos. A wave of ragged cheers erupted from the redcoats, but there was no time for celebration. With mechanical efficiency born of endless practice, they reloaded, ramming home powder and ball. They had not flinched. And incredibly, they were still advancing, stepping over the bodies of fallen horses and men as they continued their inexorable march forward. The French commander was furious. His aristocratic pride stung. He ordered a second, even larger charge, throwing in his reserves 32 squadrons of his best dragoons and cuirassiers. This time the attack was broader, heavier, aimed at overwhelming the defiant brigade through sheer mass. Once again the earth shook, and once again the red wall waited. They halted their advance, dressed their lines, and held their fire with inhuman coolness. Using a sophisticated platoon firing system, the regiments unleashed a rolling, continuous series of volleys, a ripple fire that created a sustained storm of lead. The result was the same. Carnage. The charge recoiled, broken and bleeding. The myth of cavalry superiority was being systematically dismantled, volley by bloody volley. The discipline was almost inhuman, and it proved just how powerful infantry could be. Let us know in the comments below what other impossible victories in history you'd like to see us cover next. The French were stunned. Their best cavalry was annihilated. But the exhausted infantrymen were now approaching the French cannons and 60,000 men. Their impossible advance was about to get even harder. The French center was not just broken, it was annihilated. A gaping, bleeding hole had been torn in their line. The elite French cavalry, twice shattered, was now a disorganized and demoralized mob, streaming back in retreat past their own infantry. Those French infantry brigades were now exposed, their morale crumbling. Total, crushing victory was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. It was a single, decisive cavalry charge away. Yet, on a nearby hill, the entire Allied cavalry corps, 24 fresh squadrons under the command of the incompetent cavalry general, Lord George Sackville, stood perfectly, maddeningly still. From his vantage point, the Allied commander saw the moment with perfect, agonizing clarity. This was the turning point of the battle, the war, perhaps even his career. He turned to his aide and sent him galloping towards Sackville with the most urgent order imaginable. Advance. You see the opportunity. Charge the exposed French flank. Win the battle. But Sackville did not move. He seemed confused, hesitant, perhaps even deliberately obtuse. He questioned the order. "Which flank am I to charge?" he asked, as if the massive, gaping hole in the enemy line was not plainly visible. Ferdinand, watching this in action through his spyglass in a state of rising, incandescent fury, sent a second messenger, then a third, and finally a fourth, each carrying a more frantic and explicit version of the same simple command. Charge. For God's sake, charge with the entire cavalry wing. One of his aides rode so hard his horse nearly collapsed, arriving to find Sackville still stationary, dispensing with protocol to shout the Duke's orders. Still, Sackville hesitated. Was it cowardice, a freezing of nerve at the critical moment? Was it a genuine, if incompetent, misunderstanding? Or was it something darker, a personal animosity toward his foreign German commander? The men under his command were practically vibrating with eagerness, straining at the bit, desperate to join the fray, but their commander remained paralyzed. The contrast on the field was stark and tragic. Below, in the crucible of battle, the 9 regiments of infantry who had done the impossible were exhausted and bloodied, having sustained over 1,400 casualties, nearly a third of their strength. Yet they were still pushing forward. Above them on the hill, the Allied cavalry, fresh, powerful, and untouched by the battle, sat idle on their horses, becoming mere spectators. Every second that ticked by allowed the French to organize a retreat rather than suffer a complete collapse. The battle had been won by the few, but the war for total victory was being lost by the inaction of one man. It's a moment of shocking controversy that is still debated by historians. If this story of incredible bravery and baffling inaction resonates with you, please share it with someone who appreciates history as much as you do. The battle was won not with a final, glorious charge, but with the slow, grudging retreat of a shattered army. The victory was absolute, saving Hanover and marking a decisive turn of the war. But it was a victory forever tainted by controversy. While the Allied commander, Duke Ferdinand, was hailed as a hero across Europe, the name of Lord George Sackville became synonymous with disgrace. Sent back to Britain in shame, he faced a public court-martial. The verdict was scathing, finding him guilty of disobedience and declaring him unfit to serve His Majesty in any military capacity whatsoever. It was a judgment that destroyed his career and shadowed him for the rest of his life. Yet, the true and lasting legacy of the battle belonged not to the disgraced lord or the celebrated duke, but to the humble, anonymous infantryman who had stood in the line. As the exhausted soldiers rested on the battlefield amidst the carnage, a simple, spontaneous tradition was born. In their relentless advance across the heath, they had marched through German gardens and torn through hedgerows that were blooming with wild roses. As a sign of their incredible, almost unbelievable victory, the men began to pick these roses and place them in their tricorn hats and on their tattered, powder-stained uniforms. This simple act of beauty amidst the ugliness of war became an enduring symbol of their triumph. It's a tradition that took root, a quiet tribute to the day they walked through hell and emerged, impossibly, on the other side. To this day, on the 1st of August every year, the descendant regiments of those 6 British units commemorate Minden Day. They wear roses on their headdresses in honor of their ancestors, a living reminder that history is sometimes written not by perfect plans, but by the unbelievable courage of ordinary soldiers who, on a summer morning long ago, simply followed their orders and walked into legend. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story. If you want to see more tales of the battles that shaped our world, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have notifications turned on. Let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next.